He was watching the show because he was with another girl at the time. You would tell me that you always watched it, but I guess that was your girlfriend, but you're...
There is something genuinely unsettling about watching a woman lie awake in the dark, staring at a blinking light coming from underneath the mattress she shares with her husband. Not because it's dramatic in the way reality television usually is, but because most people have been in some version of that room. Maybe not that exact room, maybe not a TLC-funded mansion with cameras in the hallway, but that feeling of lying next to someone and suddenly realizing you have no idea who they actually are. That specific, stomach-dropping quiet. That's what this whole situation with Darcey and Georgi keeps coming back to for me, and it's why I think this story is worth spending some real time on. My take going into this video is that what happened at the reunion mansion was not a single dramatic event that broke something. It was the moment something that had already been broken for a long time finally became impossible to ignore. The hidden phone is a symbol, and a genuinely strange one. But the real story is everything surrounding it. The choices that put Darcey in that room, the patterns that had been building for months, the way two sisters talked each other into a shared conclusion that may or may not have been accurate. And the fact that by the time Darcey was crying on camera, saying she just wanted her husband back, she seemed to be mourning someone who, if you squint at the actual timeline, may never have shown up the way she needed him to in the first place. So that's what we're doing here. We're going through the whole thing, piece by piece, because I think the mattress phone story gets flattened into a meme when it actually has a lot of moving parts worth thinking about. To understand why the reunion mansion became such a pressure cooker, you have to start with what was already happening in Darcey and Georgi's marriage before they walked through that door. By the time this taping happened, Georgi had been back in the United States for roughly 5 months. That's 5 months of living in Darcey's orbit, 5 months of being legally married, and from what Darcey described publicly, 5 months during which he had not taken any significant step toward building an actual shared life with her. No apartment. No concrete plans about where they were going to live or how they were going to structure their finances or their day-to-day existence as a married couple. Now, I don't have visibility into their private arrangements, and I want to be honest about that. It's possible there were conversations happening off-camera that reframe some of this, but what Darcey said publicly, on camera, in front of other cast members, is that she felt like she was carrying the weight of the relationship alone while he occupied her space without contributing to it in any meaningful way. That's a specific kind of exhaustion, and it matters because it means Darcey did not arrive at the reunion mansion as someone in a stable, secure marriage who then had one bad night. She arrived already running on fumes, already second-guessing things, already doing the mental math on whether this was going to work. The mansion didn't create the problem. It just removed the distractions she might have used to avoid looking directly at it. Reality television reunion specials are a strange format to begin with. You take people who are already living inside a media-saturated version of their own relationships, and then you put them in close physical proximity with other couples who are dealing with their own chaos, and you film all of it. The social dynamics get weird fast. People start comparing, people start performing, and people who are already anxious about their own situation become extremely attuned to what everyone else around them appears to have or not have. For Darcey, that comparison had a very specific target: her sister Stacey, and Stacey's husband Florian. The Silva twins have always been intertwined in a way that makes normal sibling dynamics look simple. They dress similarly, they've appeared on television together, and there is clearly a deep bond between them that also carries, from the outside at least, some amount of competition. I think it's actually pretty human, the way Darcey kept measuring her marriage against Stacey's. Most people who have a sibling in a relationship do some version of that internal comparison. But in the mansion, surrounded by cameras and other couples and her own mounting anxiety about Georgi, that tendency got amplified to a point where it seemed like Darcey was watching Florian and Stacey interact and using it as direct evidence of what she was or wasn't getting at home. The problem, and I say this with some caution because I'm reading from the outside, is that Stacey's marriage was also not in great shape at the time. Florian had been showing a kind of newfound independence that apparently caught Stacey off guard. So the benchmark Darcey was measuring herself against was itself unstable. Two women, both rattled, both sleep-deprived and overstimulated by the mansion environment, both looking at their husbands and feeling something was off. That's the context in which the phone gets discovered. Here is what Darcy has described. She was lying in bed at night, and she noticed a light flickering. When she looked, she realized Georgi had placed his phone underneath the mattress, on his side, where she couldn't easily reach it. The phone was lighting up with notifications, in the middle of the night. I want to be careful here because there are genuinely multiple ways to read this, and I'll get to the charitable ones in a bit. But from Darcy's perspective, in that moment, the specific choice to put the phone under the mattress rather than on the nightstand or face down on the bed communicates something. People don't usually hide their phones under mattresses by accident. It's a deliberate placement. Whether the reason for it is something serious or something mundane is a completely separate question, but the act itself is not neutral. And Darcy, lying there in the dark watching the light blink, made the completely understandable human choice to catastrophize immediately. What she apparently did not do was wake him up and ask him directly. This is the part that's interesting to me, not because she was wrong to feel scared, but because the decision to sit in the fear instead of confronting it in the moment is so recognizable. When you already don't feel secure in a relationship, asking a direct question can feel riskier than not asking. Because asking means you might get an answer you can't come back from. So you lie there, and your brain fills in the silence with whatever your worst fears are. And by the time morning comes, the story you've told yourself has calcified into something you're almost certain is true. By the next day, Darcy had brought the whole thing to the other couples in the house. She described what she'd found. She talked about the 5 months of him not getting an apartment. She laid out her frustrations in front of people who were essentially strangers to her marriage. And here's where my reading gets a little complicated. On one hand, venting to people around you when you're scared and overwhelmed is very human. On the other hand, airing that level of private marital detail to a reality TV cast guarantees it becomes part of the narrative that gets aired on television, which changes the dynamic in ways that are hard to undo. Once you've said, "My husband hides his phone under the mattress," in front of cameras, that's now a public statement about your marriage. And Georgi, whatever he was or wasn't doing with that phone, gets to respond to it in public too. Stacey's role in what happened next is worth examining separately. By this point, Stacey was dealing with her own anxieties about Florian. And when Darcy brought her the phone story, Stacey apparently confirmed Darcy's worst fears. She validated the idea that something was wrong, that Georgi was hiding something, that both of their husbands might be leading some kind of double life. I don't think Stacey did this out of malice. I think she did it because she herself was scared and uncertain. And when you're scared and your twin sister comes to you with a story that rhymes with your own fear, you reach for confirmation rather than skepticism. But the effect was that two women who were both already anxious ended up in a feedback loop, each one amplifying the other's dread until they arrived at the double divorce conclusion together. The double divorce framing is fascinating to me because of what it reveals about how Darcy and Stacey process their lives. They came to the mutual conclusion, apparently while still in the mansion, that both their marriages were probably over and that both their husbands were using them. That's a large conclusion to reach based on a blinking phone and some general dissatisfaction. I'm not saying they were wrong necessarily. I genuinely don't know what Georgi was doing on that phone. But the speed with which they got from suspicious behavior to both marriages are finished tells you something about the emotional state they were both in. It felt less like a conclusion they reasoned their way to and more like a prophecy they decided to fulfill together. When Georgi was confronted about the phone, his response did not help his case. He deflected. He didn't show Darcy the messages. He didn't offer a simple explanation. Instead, according to what was shown and described publicly, he turned the conversation around and came at her for wanting them to live together, framing her expectation of cohabitation as some kind of unreasonable demand. That's a strange move. Whether or not the phone contained anything damning, responding to your wife's concern about secret midnight notifications by attacking her for wanting to share a home is not the response of someone who has nothing to hide and wants to reassure their partner. It's the response of someone who either does have something to hide or who has decided that offense is a better strategy than transparency. Neither of those reads well. I want to take a moment with the most charitable possible interpretation of Georgi's behavior because I think it's worth doing honestly rather than as a formality. It is possible that the phone under the mattress was something genuinely innocent. He might have been corresponding with family back home at times that didn't account for the time difference, and he shoved the phone under the mattress so the light wouldn't wake Darcy up. It's possible. The not getting an apartment situation could have a real explanation related to finances or immigration complexity that simply wasn't covered on camera. And his defensive reaction during the confrontation could be the response of a man who felt he was being publicly accused on television and reacted badly to that pressure rather than out of guilt. These explanations are plausible. I can hold them as possibilities. What I can't do is pretend that any of them are supported by what he actually said or did in that conversation. If you have an innocent explanation for the phone, you give it immediately and you show your wife the screen. That's what someone with nothing to hide does when their anxious spouse is spiraling. What Georgi did instead was pivot away from the question and redirect the blame. That's a very different move, and I don't have a charitable read on it that also squares with the facts as they've been described. There is a pattern in Darcy's history on this show, and I think it would be dishonest to talk about this situation without acknowledging it, even briefly. Darcy has a tendency to select partners who keep her at arm's length, and then she pours enormous emotional energy into trying to close that distance. She did this before Georgi on earlier seasons. She seems to find something compelling about men who are slightly out of reach, and then she gets devastated when the reach doesn't close. That's a pattern that has more to do with Darcy than with any individual man, and I say that not to blame her, but because understanding it matters for understanding the reunion mansion situation. Because the question isn't just, what was Georgi doing with that phone? The question is also, what was Darcy doing in a mansion, on television, with a marriage that had been showing these cracks for months, instead of having private, direct conversations with her husband about what she actually needed? She went into a high-pressure, camera-filled environment with a relationship that needed quiet and honesty, and the environment delivered the opposite of both of those things. I'm not saying she had no right to be there, or that she caused Georgi's behavior. I'm saying she made a choice that put her in the worst possible position to address the thing she was most scared of. And that choice has a fingerprint of self-sabotage on it, regardless of what Georgi was doing. The final image that stuck with me from this whole chapter of their story is Darcy crying and saying she just wanted her husband back. That sentiment is real and it's sad, and I believe she meant it completely. But what's haunting about it is the specificity of the word back. Back implies he was there at some point in the way she needed him to be. And when you look at the timeline, at the 5 months of no apartment, at the deflections, at the phone in the dark, it's worth asking whether the version of Georgi she was mourning was ever actually present in the way she experienced him being. Sometimes people cry for something they lost, and sometimes they cry for something they thought they had, but that was always slightly different than what they believed it to be. I could be completely wrong about that. It's possible there was a version of this marriage that was warm and reciprocal and present in ways the cameras never caught. Television edits everything, including the good parts. But from what's been shown and said publicly, the picture that emerges is of two people who wanted very different things and who communicated about those differences through conflict and deflection rather than through anything that looked like clarity or repair. The double divorce prophecy, whatever it turns out to mean in the longer arc of both women's relationships, feels less like a prediction and more like a decision. Once you've named something that clearly and that publicly, it becomes very hard to walk it back. Darcey and Stacey essentially declared their marriages over together, in front of cameras, in a context designed to broadcast that declaration. Whatever either of their husbands did or didn't do, that moment changed the relational terrain in ways that are hard to reverse. You don't say something like that. What I keep coming back to is that the mattress phone, the blinking light in the dark, is genuinely a compelling image for what this whole story is about. It's about what happens when you're lying next to someone who has kept a part of themselves just slightly out of your reach, and you've kept telling yourself that the distance is temporary, that it's going to close, that you can get there if you just hold on. And then one night the light blinks, and you realize you were never quite as close as you thought. The phone under the mattress isn't a betrayal. The betrayal, if there is one, is the months of pretending the distance wasn't there. Whether Georgi was texting another woman, planning something or doing something entirely unremarkable that he just handled badly when confronted, I genuinely cannot say. I don't have that information, and neither does anyone who wasn't in that room. What I can say is that a man who had nothing to hide and wanted to keep his marriage intact would have handled that conversation very differently than the way it appears to have gone. And a woman who was fully committed to making the marriage work would probably have chosen a different arena than a TLC reunion mansion to surface 5 months of accumulated fear. They were both, in their own ways, not quite where the other one needed them to be, and they played that out on camera, which means the rest of us got to watch the blinking light and wonder about it too. That's the story, as honestly as I can tell it with what I actually know.